Welcome to the Change My View podcast, episode 02121. It is Sunday, April 22nd, 2018. I'm your host, Michael Hatch, here with founder Cal Turnbull and moderator Pepperoni Fire, whose two articles of hers we're going to be focusing on today, topics that are deeply relevant to the evolving mediums that we all spend so much time on. So, Pepperoni, I thought since these are your babies, we'd get right to you, but let's just do a quick go around. Hello, Cal, are you there?
Hello, Michael. How are you doing?
Good. That's Cal Turnbull from Scotland there. And Pepperoni?
Hello, how are you? You can call me Liz.
Liz, yes. And Michael Hatch in San Diego, California, on vacation here. So, so we are just going to, Pep, if you want to take the lead here and just walk us through this first article and sort of maybe a little bit of what led you to initially write it and then what it's about.
Sure. So the article we're talking about is about quote unquote armchair moderation. And I was trying to integrate some of the lessons that I learned moderating Change My View into my professional interest of risk management, which is what I spend most of my time doing on a daily basis. And I felt like it was important to talk about because there's a lot of abstract conversation about the role of Facebook, about whether it's been responsible or not. And I kind of wanted to take a pass, knowing nothing about internally what's happening at Facebook, of some practical ways in which they could maybe address this issue in a responsible way, based on some of the lessons I've taken from moderating a lot of user content, a lot of user generated content on Reddit.
Great. Okay. So you're at the end here, you have a nice sort of summary section with some bullet points, but I thought maybe we might go through just paragraph to paragraph to give us a little more. So did you want to start maybe at the top there and off the title?
Sure. So the title is Armchair Moderation, or How I Learned Not to Worry and Love User-Generated Content. And I took a view to this through the journalistic lens of where people are concerned about basically how they are spending their time online and the information that they are exposed to. And a lot of ways.
I'm sorry, Liz, just real quick, I should have mentioned. These two articles are a part of the changemyview.net blog, where new articles are put up fairly regularly. These two happen to both be authored by Liz. So just so people will know where to find it, changemyview.net blog.
Sure. Cool. So just going back to my original point is that I was inspired a lot by Tristan Harris's work on Time Well Spent. He talks a lot about how design can have implications on how people feel or how they engage with others. So I started thinking about how Facebook can address some of its issues with how people interact with one another and how they engage with the information that is presented to them online via a few design changes. And a lot of those design changes are on the back end, reflecting a lot of the tools that we use as moderators to sift through a lot of user-generated content, and not just a lot of user-generated content, but a lot of posts that are contentious, strongly opinionated, and definitely engender a lot of thorough disagreement. So I want to make it clear that we never really shy away from tough conversations, and yet nevertheless we've, at least by the feedback we've received, managed to create a space where people feel like they can have those conversations without feeling like they're attacked. And that brings me to a conclusion that, again, based on feedback we've received, that people feel like the time they are spending at Change My View is constructive, and that they keep coming back to it because they feel better having had that good interaction with other people. And so if you look at my post, I say, well, how do we achieve that? How do we facilitate that back and forth? And that's where I began diving into some of the actual mechanisms we use on the back end that people maybe don't see that could potentially be useful if you are working at Facebook and trying to figure out how you can deal with that issue without coming off as a heavy-handed censor or as someone who doesn't care about the integrity of what's being posted online.
Great. And so there's a point you made in this first section where you said crowdsourcing journalistic trust is a bad idea. This is, I'm quoting Liz here, but you're also saying, plus, if people can game your algorithm, they can game your survey or whatever else that you're trying to get, like just pure user feedback in. So can you contrast that maybe with some of those back end things that have been so useful for Change My View to create these better conversations?
Sure. So the issue with the algorithm is that, again, not knowing specifically what they are gauging for, it's a lot of garbage in, garbage out. So if you begin crowdsourcing something, you can get a lot of garbage in once people figure out what you're looking for. So that would mean large swaths of people. We've all heard of Google bombs. Back in the day, you could kind of game the Google algorithm to get a search result to the top. That's the garbage in, and the garbage out is the bomb at the end, where the top search result doesn't necessarily reflect what Google wanted to surface to the top. So when I say crowdsourcing, I'm very averse to that, because I can see a situation where people go in and they figure out some of the nodes that are going to result in a journal, a publication being rated as trustworthy, and basically making it come off as trustworthy when maybe it's not. Maybe it just expresses a user preference, which is different. With respect to what we do, is we rely a lot more on crowdsourcing norms. We have a set of rules that people have to conform to, but we understand that while one incentive is to avoid punishment based on breaking those rules, a bigger incentive is that people buy into the community at large, that they feel that those rules are fair, and that they are based on a set of shared values that the community has. So we crowdsource a lot of reporting functions where a user can report a comment or a post saying, we think this violates the rule as we understand it based on what you've told us. And as time goes on, we don't necessarily remove every report, but it gets people to further buy into the community standards that we've been trying to cultivate the entire time. And it also makes people more likely to behave in that manner, because they're not doing it just to avoid a punishment. They're doing it because they really like the community that's being built and they want to continue it.
So it's sort of a system that can build on the pre-existing hardware, software we have or whatever, to be a part of a community and subconsciously sort of almost have a feel for what those standards are once you see them for long enough, rather than just interacting with some board game one time with rules. This is something more deeply embedded.
Yeah, it definitely relies upon people coming back, that there's an iterative interaction where people can't discount the future of interacting with other people or interacting with the mods. One thing I noticed when Mark Zuckerberg was testifying in front of Congress is that he said, who am I to make those decisions? And I think that contrasts a lot with what Cal has built, where he says, we are making decisions and we're owning them, but we're going to tell you where we're coming from. And so when people flag things on Facebook, I'm not convinced they're doing it for any reason other than the fact that it is like either deeply offensive to their personal sensibilities or to remove content to troll. Whereas I think when people report things and Change My View, yes, we do get a lot of false positives. I shouldn't say a lot. We've gotten quite a bit better, but we have gotten false positives where people are, treating it as a super downvote. But we get many more good faith reports where people are like, I don't think this conforms to what Change My View is supposed to be. There's a rule that's tied to it, so I'm going to report it. And then the moderator's eyes get on it, and we can make a call as to whether it should actually be removed for a violation.
Yeah. So what we've got built in has taken 5 or 7 years. I think it's six years, Cal, 7 years? That we've
5 years.
To hone these? That's right, okay. So to hone that down, and so is it kind of like, where you have a second world economy having a great deal of growth because they are able to benefit from technologies of countries that developed them first, and then you could just run for it? Like can Facebook do a quick catch up with all the lessons we've learned? Or do you think it'll take them longer to institutionally change things that could improve their discussions?
Are you asking me, Cal, or both?
Oh, whoever, yeah.
So I'll start, and then Cal can probably build off of it. I think it's twofold. I think there's a lot that Facebook has that they can use mechanically to basically copy what we do in order to get our eyes on comments. Like we have a mod queue. I'm pretty sure there's probably something within Facebook where when something is flagged, either it's automatically removed or it hits a queue. So that's something where I think Facebook almost certainly, with the resources and knowledge it has, could copy and paste almost. But what's more difficult is, again, this buy-in that we have, not just from our users, but internally as a quote unquote work culture between the moderators. I think everybody that has been onboarded as a moderator was formerly a user and has this fundamental understanding and internal cultural appreciation for what the end game is. And I'm not convinced that Facebook, because it views itself as a platform and because its leadership has really rejected kind of owning content curation, that that's there. And that is something that's really going to take a lot of time to build. And again, just to add one more thing, and then Cal can jump in, is like, through our interactions over 5 or 6, 7 years, sorry, I didn't catch how long it had actually been. We've
5
built
years, 3 months.
What?
5 years, 3 months.
5 years, 3 months. Is that we've built a relationship with a lot of users that have been here for a huge chunk of that. And when you build trust with your community, they're a lot more likely to, when they do push back, be constructive about it and assume good faith. But more often than not, just kind of trust you to make a good decision, and speak up when they feel it's a problem, rather than create a culture of just having a knee-jerk reaction of, this is censorship, this is bad, you can't do this, you can't do that. They always engage with us in a really kind of positive manner that actually reflects the kind of conversations we've been trying to create online in the first place.
Well put, Cal.
Yeah, just while I was listening to you there, I kind of had a thought that I wanted to throw out and see maybe what either of you think about this, because I was kind of thinking about this problem and maybe what Facebook could learn from something like Change My View. And it kind of occurred to me that maybe we're fundamentally different in that Facebook puts itself across as, like you say, it's a platform. I wonder, Change My View, maybe we aren't really a platform in the same way. We are an experience. So we are curated. We have a very specific goal with rules that achieve that goal. And in some ways, we don't claim to be like a platform where you can just come and do what you want. We are an experience that you can sign up to, the view changing experience where you can put your view out there, or you can try and change someone else's view, so long as you play by our rules. I guess Facebook has a much wider problem than CMV specifically, because they are literally just somewhere where people can go and be sociable. In some ways, I guess maybe it's worth comparing Facebook with Reddit at large, and seeing maybe what Reddit's doing as a company, because what we're doing, I think there's a lot of lessons in it, but it's hard to directly compare. I mean, what do you think about that idea of platform versus experience?
I think that is a fair point. I'll get my pride out of the way in saying that I think there's a bit of a leadership issue at Facebook, where they're getting, the teams are probably getting conflicting messages, because the leadership has gone on the record as saying, our goal is to connect people. Just like CMV's goal is to create a space where people can engage and possibly change their view. That's very different from the more, I guess, legalistic argument of, we're just a platform. Because at the end of the day, even if your platform is a conduit, it's a conduit based on their own admission of connecting people. So even if they're not there to create a space where people can have a really tough conversation, I do think it's fair to point out that they're connecting people is going to have implications. We've seen it in Myanmar. We've seen it in the U.S. election. We've seen it in how people feel like they are not engaging well with other people. And that embedded in that, maybe they don't need the same rules or the same level of curation, but they do need to think a little bit more about the content that is being created on their platform and what they can do to generate a better experience and a better feeling of spending time on Facebook, such that the risk of having that kind of experience, of having those kinds of consequences, diminishes at least a little bit more. What about you, Michael?
My first thought on this, and I'm borrowing from a quote from The West Wing, which I think might have actually been misquoted. So it actually goes back to Oscar Wilde. Basically, the way it goes is this: is when the gods want to laugh, they answer our prayers. Or another version, when the gods want to punish us, they answer our prayers. And I look at two sides of this coin here is sort of let's look at Change My View versus Facebook. You know, is Facebook in some ways, this is just what the humans want. You know, this is the gods answering our prayers. Like this is what you wanted. Here's your platform. Like you got news bias because you're literally by design biased. It's part of our makeup. You know, so to what degree can we have something like this very precisely honed sort of nuclear vacuum chamber that's been over 5 years and 3 months and Changed My View? We've improved this condition to create these ideal conditions inside for just the right, you know, homeostasis to have this better conversation, or at least our specific type of conversation. So I mean, at the end of the day, is it just a niche arena where that percentage of people who care enough to really want to be that introspective and self-correcting to come here and do it? Or is it scalable to humanity writ large, like Facebook can be? And I'm not saying that Facebook's all bad. Obviously, there's a lot of good stuff there too. And connecting people, in principle, is not. It's vague, but it, you know, can be good in a lot of ways too. So we're specific. They're broad. They're probably more mapped accurately to just like raw human nature, versus ours is maybe slightly more artificial. But then every major leap forward in a way has been a little bit artificial. And to me, I see that as progress. I think we can do a lot more broadly across our various media to improve our conversation. But I think a lot of that's going to have to come from people and demanding a better bubble. Like, I think you're going to want to be able to customize, like, okay, what do I want to take opinion pieces? I don't care if they come from the Washington Post, New York Times, Fox News, or whatever. I have no time for opinion pieces. Like, I would filter them out tomorrow. You know, like I would want to filter out anything that has a scientific article claim that didn't pass a test, where the title of the article didn't match the title of the scientific journal article, or the title of the article misrepresented it. Like, there'd be little tests linking everything. And as a user, I don't have time to fact check everything. But if I spend 2 days in deep research and find one very small question I can fact check, it is free for me to distribute it across the whole internet. You know, so all you need is enough interested people to do those, to help create some other automated tools that give you the power as a consumer to choose what tools or not you're going to use to filter stuff out. I think if you're in your settings menu saying, these are the things I want to see and don't, you're going to be at the better. It's like going to the grocery store with a full stomach. You're not going to make dumb decisions. Like, you're going to be that better version of yourself when you're putting your settings in place before you just jump back into your casual social media browsing. I see hope in that, but I think we're nowhere near getting all the way there. But there's a lot to learn from us to pull some of the other stuff forward into something more organized and useful.
So I'd love to jump in if that's okay, because I have two quick thoughts. The first is that I think implicit in your conversation about Facebook is that, is this just what we want? One of the posts that we also made was about Reddit's redesign and how design implications, and we'll get to this later, but how something can be designed just by how you design it can make people conform to a mode of behavior that is maybe contrary to how they would normally behave. So I think we have to consider that maybe in Facebook, you can like something, but you can't dislike something. You can have this emote, but not that emote. Like, it's not just about the algorithm that surfaces information, but it's about how people are allowed to interact with one another. And Cal made a point earlier when we were discussing beforehand about how Reddit at large is ultimately about community interest and shared interests, less than an individual's day-to-day, hourly, status updates. And that's by design. That's not something that is just answering necessarily our prayers, because both allow people to interact, but they just allow them to interact in a different way. And then the second point is that CMV, it kind of creates a sort of internet literacy, in that it gets people through our rules to interact with positions in a specific way. So you said you don't have time to fact check, which I completely understand. Like, it is asking a lot, especially with the news today, to fact check everything. But I do think people get in the habit of getting what I'll call like a BS meter, which is like, over time, based on exposing yourself to conflicting points of view and having to engage with them, you get an understanding of when someone is yanking your chain or has a point of view and is not interested in presenting it fairly, versus someone who is presenting information that might have disagreeable points, but their main thesis is worth engaging with.
I don't know if I trust my BS meter. I really want to outsource this. I just don't think I'm, even my gut instinct on this. I think I read an article that you forwarded that gave a great analysis of this IRA, not Irish, but Russian intelligence IRA. I think I saw it from your Twitter, Pepperoni. It was a great read, a great breakdown. I still don't really know anything about the writers, but it passed all my BS tests and the way it was written. It didn't have a lot of weasel words, and it was pretty, but I still don't know if I'd, bet my kids on it or something, like I still have a little bit of nervousness that I don't know enough about the writers totally,
But do you need to know the writer, or do you need to know that the publication has a reputation for posting things that are vetted? Or do you need
publication's fine. There's just a lot of there's so many new news sources now that I can't keep up with knowing which ones are trustable. Like I was pretty cool with Vox for a while. They recently had some disingenuous stuff relating to Sam Harris, although there's sort of a 50-50 on the two of them. There's an interesting squabble happening. But now I have to double check those things though, because a lot of the stuff is good stuff. And it's just, I've seen a lot of other stuff from major news sources. You'll occasionally swing and miss one. Something will slip through and you're like, how did that get through? I don't know.
The question is that I don't think human beings, whether they're the people on the back end who are trying to devote their time to figuring out what's fundamentally true, or people on the front end who are trying to figure out what's true after reading something, I don't think we're ever going to get to that answer, because systems are designed by people. People are fallible. But I do think that you can get people in the habit of engaging with the information presented to them with an eye that is skeptical until certain bare thresholds are met. Because when we talk about, like when I talk to my father about some of the stuff that he is reading online, a lot of that wouldn't even pass the bad smell test. Like if you go to the website, there's no corporation that's affiliated with it. There's no LLC. There's no contact us. There's no address. There's a lot of typographical errors. A lot of the links are dead. Like these are things that I think over time I've gotten in the habit of checking, because not just of CMV, but because of all the other forums I visited online before there was a Facebook. And it takes a modicum of effort. But when you think of the time that people are spending on Facebook, I do not think it is the clicking through effort that is the issue. I think it's that people are just, they have not been habituated to thinking about Facebook as a place where people are surfacing what they want others to see, as opposed to traditional news sources where what is surfaced on the back end has had a publication barrier. So that requires a need for people to engage with information in the way that Change My View has cultivated. But I think, Cal, you looked like you had something you wanted to say to Mihatch's question, and I want to make sure that we cover that ground as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say that it sounds, Michael, like you would use that tool you described earlier for good reasons, as in the kind of fact-checking reasons. But it could possibly be used for bad reasons, echo chamber kind of purposes as well. Do you think that would be something to look out for along these lines? So
I think in that the whole purpose of such a project would be in the interest of the time well spent. I don't know if fact checking is time well spent, as long as one or two other trusted entities have done the fact checking. I just want to get auto alerted to it, or have it auto filtered if it's already if reliable entities that have a proven track record. It's like lending money and a credit score. Like if you built it up with a long time and don't have a lot of corrections, and you don't, or any corrections you have, you've gone back and made and apologized, you've really covered your bases, like correcting your credit score and paying off old debts. You can earn a reputation to be trustworthy and then be ranked by your trustworthiness. And I mean, you wouldn't have just one institution doing this. You would want multiple, like there's multiple credit agencies. It could be self-correcting, and the whole thing would have embedded in it the transparency from top to bottom for every filtering it's doing, because otherwise it would be hypocritical to not have the whole thing be open.
Yeah,
it's just all sunshine. Yeah,
it was just the word like filter, and whether it was up to the person in what was being filtered, that just kind of like set off a bell in my head that thought, maybe this would be used for, don't show me anything relating to this other view that I just don't want to hear anything about.
I think you would have to have a whole department whose whole job is just to prove that their own group is bad. Each group puts things that are wrong every day and like announce it to the world, not even internally.
Yeah.
Like
and I should even clarify that point I just made as well, because there was an interesting, seeing as we're talking about changebyview.net blog posts, there was another one by a CMV user that related to the negatives and positives of the kind of idea of polarization, and maybe sometimes it is okay if someone doesn't want to have like all views shoved down their throat all the time, and sometimes it's okay if maybe they want to go and discuss something specifically without being bombarded. But generally I do kind of follow the idea that echo chambers are bad. I feel that's pretty clear that I think that through my involvement and creation of Change by View. But I thought I would just clarify that maybe there's some side points, and people should read that or blog post if they're
Michael,
interested.
When you say filter, do you mean the user filters on their user preferences, or filter as in, okay. So I think that's where we might be disagreeing, because I'm fine with that notion of there are some barriers to entry that should be met before a publication ends up in the news feed with, I guess, put like a check mark next to it, sort of like the Twitter verification to say that this person, we know a human being was behind posting it. It wasn't posted by a bot. Or we know that someone has put their name to this piece of work. Like, for example, like Washington Post has a point of contact that they've submitted to Facebook, where if something truly goes awry, Facebook has a communication channel to Washington Post to like deal with it at a higher level. But I don't.
Yeah, a red phone. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't like the idea. I think it would be less useful for people in their user feed to be able to say, I only want to see this news source or that news source. I would be, I guess, okay. And this is a nascent consideration, so I don't want to marry myself to it. But like someone who says, to Cal's point, like, today I don't want to see the news feed. Today I just want to see baby pictures. Like that's something that I think is fair.
Yeah, I think empowering the individual users to the best versions of themselves to make those filtering decisions, I think would be a positive. It's an introspective 30,000-foot exercise in a way. If you're setting your social media feed things, it'll make you think. It empowers you, but it also makes you think, well, what do I want to see? But I there is an additional component though, where like I don't know if you've seen on like the back of a big rig truck, like a diamond placard with like blue, red, yellow letters or numbers on it. And the reason those are there is that it's an NFPA 704. It's basically a fire trucks know if there's a crash, what's in that truck, and they can know right away because they have to know in seconds. So they can look at this placard and see there's 3 categories of flammability, health, and instability/reactivity, right? So poison, explodey, and burning, right? So if you had 3 categories like that, just simple categories like spin, bull, and dodge, right? Or something with news sources or information from the world, it wouldn't be as simple as a check. It would be like a little, very simple symbol that quickly gives you all the information. Is it from a reliable source? Does the title match the substance? Or you could have a short list of things. Then I think that would be useful as well. But that itself could be customized by the user too. Like what do you want on your placard or on the like periodic table of elements square that has numbers on it? Like just a quick hit, right away what you're getting, what the source is.
I mean, I think users should have to engage with that information. I think they should have to see whether a title doesn't match the source, and then it's on them to decide whether or not they're willing to take that at face value. I think that there's one of the hazards of automating content curation is that people get lazy about working with the information put in front of them. And that is my biggest concern, because I don't think we're ever going to get to, like, let's use your features. Let's say that all 3 are tagged. It's verified, substance matches the source, and what was the other one?
I have dozens of these. I just picked them off the top of my head.
There's a 3-part checklist, and they check.
Yeah, let's say rate of weasel words.
Right. You're still going to have a lot of information that I don't want to say that is necessarily dubious, but like you can hit those check marks and still have a lot of information that is questionable, that is disagreeable, that is potentially dubious. And at CMV, we want our users to be able to engage with that and say, well, why are you relying on this particular source? Like, I know it matches everything, but here are some issues that I found with it, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. In terms of CMV, I totally agree with you. I like the let it breathe conversation there. Yeah.
Sure, but like to pivot back to Facebook, which and similar social media avenues, is that because we're still going to ultimately be dealing with fallible human beings creating this system, and because fallible human beings are going to be analyzing that information, the best case scenario is to get them in the habit of saying, okay, I theoretically want to see all these check marks, so I know it's not a false link. I know that the basic threshold of information matching is there, but I still have to grapple with the substantive aims of what this publication is arguing or proposing or exploring. And it changed my view because of our community norms in that rule set. People are more likely than not to not just question the source and see if it's worth listening to, but then go a step further and engage with the substantive content, with the thesis of that source. And it's that next step that I think Facebook can't automate, but it can create a set of community norms via like standards and rules where people get in the habit of doing that with their Facebook feed. Because just to highlight again, people like my parents, for example, are coming from a world where previously that information was given to them after an extremely thorough editorial process.
Yeah.
That is not the case anymore. And I think people have not gotten in the habit of engaging with news presented to them on Facebook, taking that reality into account. And so the point I was trying to make here is that there are some things you can automate to get through the very low threshold of, is this a reliable link? Is this a reliable quote unquote source? But the next pivot is you really need a set of rules and norms that cultivate a community where they engage with the underlying substantive content. And that is very difficult, but I think that we have some lessons learned that maybe Cal can dive into, that we found were successful on Change My View. Because again, we allow a lot of, frankly, nonsense to come through. People have a lot of weird views. People still engage with them well.
Well, I wonder if there's a possible solution here in that, like you say, it's very hard to kind of deal with the problem of incorrect information being spread around quickly. But I wonder if maybe something like Facebook could help by, say, for example, in order to help spread something that's wrong, well, possibly wrong, because they don't know that, you have to somehow subscribe to the updates of that article. So Facebook would notify you if through their systems they had found out that the title was wrong or that there was some inaccurate information. Everyone who shared it or everyone who had played a part in its spreading was somehow made aware that there was a problem. I mean, it wouldn't deal with it completely. It wouldn't get rid of those problems where they would just ignore the update. But I think it would help.
That's a cool idea.
Yeah. And it kind of plays into the idea of Change My Views like Delta system in some way. I mean, it kind of it allows people to open themselves up to the idea that things are wrong, by Facebook updating them on corrections.
Kale, that's super interesting.
Yeah.
Do you think Facebook could benefit from not the Delta system per se, but what the Delta system ultimately reflects is that people can change their mind they can be wrong. They can just have a different point of view at the end. And it's not viewed as a loss. So when we talk about Facebook and design and it has the like, do you think Facebook could benefit from something that says, you know what, something about this made me walk away feeling like I thought about it a bit more? Just something that kind of changes the dichotomy so that the way people engage with one another is a lot less like, dislike, agree, disagree, and a lot more thoughtful, engaging, or, even like I walked away from this with a different perspective. The kind of high effort reward that people can accumulate that requires work, but that also frames the conversation fundamentally different from, I like this. My father posts a lot of stuff on Facebook that I dislike. And I would say 80 to 90% of it, I also think to be BS. But there's this 10% that is a lot more thoughtful and substantive. And it has resulted in a lot of good conversations online. where we disagreed, and I did not walk away wanting to say, I like this source, I agree with this source, but I would want to say, I liked this conversation, I enjoyed this conversation, I came away with something beneficial, I learned something. And there's nothing on Facebook that lets me say that. And there's nothing that my dad gets that is positive feedback to him saying, this is the kind of behavior that will make my daughter not hate me. I'm being facetious. I love my father very much.
But you want positive reinforcement.
Yeah, and I think there is literature out there saying that negative reinforcement, people really fear things they can lose rather than aspire to things they can get. But I don't think that that's the end of the conversation. Like, there are so many layers to design on Facebook that you can really start experimenting with positive feedback to see like how that changes people's behavior. And it would be really interesting to see, because Facebook has so much data, what the implications are of that, assuming they could use it responsibly, which is a whole nother issue.
Yeah.
Well, just to answer your question, it's interesting to me because this is, I believe, how Tristan Harris and Sam Harris came to know about the Change My View subreddit, because they were talking on Sam Harris's podcast about this idea of a change my mind or change my view button on Facebook.
And he's got the 10% Happier podcast, right, Tristan Harris?
I'm not sure. All I know is that this is how Change My View came to their attention, because afterwards on Twitter, I think some people must have notified them. But yeah, I've thought about this. I think it's an interesting idea. The kind of, I agree that the like thing is like, it's very one-dimensional. It doesn't represent like every reaction. I mean, they've tried to introduce other reactions too. But yeah, my kind of feeling was less on the interaction of people in the comments on Facebook, which I think is a hard problem to address, because in Change My View, we have, like I said, we've got an experience that people sign up for. We've got a specific purpose. Facebook, by design, doesn't take any stance on that. You can sign up to Facebook if you want to rant or if you want to do whatever you want, like so long as it's not illegal. I mean, I think they don't mind. But yeah, I think some kind of Delta button on a comment could be useful. But I actually think they've got a better opportunity, like I was referring to earlier, in the kind of spread of information where perhaps, I don't know if they would use the Delta symbol or whatever, but like I was saying, they would get a notification that was like, oh, here's a Delta, something you shared has changed. Do you want to acknowledge this change? And if you did, then maybe you would get a Delta or something like, and on Facebook, the Deltas would represent your acknowledgement that something you shared had changed, which would be like a really fascinating thing to see happen.
Well, what about like a button? You just like this, like That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, they could do that. I mean, is there an emoji for this?
Just to make it as simple as possible. I think there is a emoji.
What about a tag? I'm anti-emoji. I think they remind me way too much of AOL chats right now.
Yeah, I don't like emojis either, and
I'm really pro emoji, but I feel like we can. I don't know. Maybe just try and not think about that, which divides us. No. I mean, I could see how a hashtag topically could be a thing. I'm just wondering about, Facebook has that edge on, and this is all for the sake of my audience here, doesn't like emojis, the lower common denominator category. I'm saying, generally speaking, not citing data, but I think that's a feeling a lot of people share, and I'll just leave it at that. It's easy to click a face. If you want to get people to do the maybe they're not up for a dissertation, but they're down to like just click a made me think,
Yeah, and just to update anyone who's unfamiliar, the Delta system in Change My View is a system in which we use the Delta symbol, which has a history of meaning change in mathematics. And basically, we just have found it's a really useful thing to make people acknowledge their changed views through this symbol. So I guess there's an opportunity for something like Facebook to use this idea. I think it is, like I said before, a bit more complicated in that they have no specific there's no requirement to engage in this kind of behavior on Facebook. But I think like I said, the biggest problem is the spreading of incorrect information. And they play a bigger role in that than we do. because we're all about examining information, and perhaps that's why we don't get much kind of resistance to what we're doing.
Yeah, I don't think that the goal of the post that I made was, I mean, this is just to iterate off of what you're saying, was not to like create like a CMV Facebook, but sort of explore a bit further. If Facebook took the step of, through leadership, kind of owning, dealing with the content that is posted on their platform, what are some things they could maybe start experimenting with, and then assessing based on their metrics, better time spent on Facebook. So we have two tiers, one of which I think we've covered was, the disinformation online. Like that's one thing. That's basically, we could look at that as like it's a post, the spreading of certain kind of posts. And then the actual reactions to information presented to them, which is the question of, how does design, the like button, the emojis, how would a delta or some kind of tag, like how would that all play together to get people to engage with one another in a certain way? So I don't think it would ever be like CMV, but I do think CMV has demonstrated that people can talk about contentious things and still walk away feeling like it was a good time. Not a fun time necessarily, though maybe, but like time well spent. Because I think underlying a lot of the concerns about Facebook is, yes, there's this disinformation, but a lot of people are conflating things like partisanship and politics and cultural movements as a negative experience, to talk about online. And I fundamentally disagree with that. I think it is the way in which we've been engaging with one another, vis-a-vis those topics, that has been has been poor time spent. That is a bad phrase. Has been a bad time spent. I don't know how you guys.
Good time after bad.
What?
I was just saying, good time after bad. Go ahead, Cal.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say as well that Liz referred to the fact that through using CMV, she has kind of increased her BS meter. And I think another thing that I've experienced in my 5+ years here is that I think I've become more patient and less quick to make a judgment or state a view, in that I've seen so many people have so many changes of view, and myself through reading have changed my own views. And I think that there's a real good end result of this, in which that people become less kind of judgmental immediately. And if you go onto Facebook and Twitter, etc., you see a lot of people doing a lot of hot takes or whatever, where they're just jumping straight into the kind of anger. And I think maybe the ideas of change my view chill you out slightly. And I don't claim that it's a chill place. There's a lot of obviously passion and there is some heated discussions. But I think the longer you stay on change my view, you become more kind of patient, I guess is my point.
Yeah, my self-conception before Change My View was very much tied to what I believed to be right and true. I still take very strong positions on a smattering of issues, but I think the thing that's most important to my self-conception now, to my identity, I guess, having moderated Change My View, is that if someone presents me with stuff that is compelling, I will engage with it in a way where I am open to changing my mind. I'm not committing to change my mind. I think I'm as close to right as a person can be on a lot of issues. But if someone comes up to me next year with a source, with an argument, with a value-based argument that I find compelling, I'm not going to feel like my self-conception has diminished at all because they convinced me to think something different.
So that baseline, I think, probably adaptive up until recently, instinct to maintain a coherent paradigm, perhaps even through life, through the tribe, worked and was really good. And the counterintuitive thing of the changing my view is quite vulnerable and can be seen as a power shifting. But in the people I talk to nowadays, I don't know if it's just because the world's a little safer, people seem really open to saying it is a good idea to change my mind. It is, am I just talking to the right people, or do you think that it's more, you're seeing more of a friendliness around it?
So I don't want to interrupt too fast, but I'll forget this. I was listening to the
That's it.
Hidden Brain podcast, and they were talking about how they, through an experiment that you would listen to in the podcast, they were measuring for a change in self-reported preferences, and they noticed that those self-reported preferences never changed after the change variable was introduced. But when they looked at people's behavior, a lot had changed. So I think maybe the question is that I think for people, it's important to say that they're open-minded, and maybe I'm falling victim to this as well. But what the delta does is it actually measures people who are willing to report that a view has been changed. It measures their behavior. It says, I have changed my view and I'm willing to publicize that. Whereas I think a lot of people like to walk around and say, of course I'm open-minded. Like, of course I'm open-minded. Like, that's just something that we value as a society, at least in the US and most countries I'm, personally familiar with. I don't know if I'm convinced that necessarily people are acting in that way.
Yeah. I wonder, so I noticed something on, this is another subreddit with a lot of strict rules called Ask Historians. And someone had asked a really interesting question. It was near the top of the front page, and it was about Nixon, and basically like, Nixon had the highest vote margin in American history, consistently led the Gallup poll. He was going to win. Why did he bother breaking the law to undermine the Democrats, right? Which ultimately was his undoing. And after 9 hours of the post, there were no responses. The only response was a ton of deleted response and one comment from the mods. And they realized this was conspicuous because it was a very high rate post with no approved comments. And there were probably hundreds of attempts. And they broke down this whole thing, but they said they had one really interesting fact. And they said it takes an average of 9 hours for a good answer to appear on a popular Ask Historians thread. So in a sense, they're probably a little stricter than we are, right? Because they're just doing a baseline fact or a baseline analysis. They don't even allow tertiary sources. It's only primary and secondary. So like on a spectrum like that, could you create a rigid enough subreddit whose only job was to just settle issues? Like what if they're like, we actually found the correct answer to the global warming issue. We've looked at every side in a really fair, honest exchange, and we actually have the correct answer now on every topic. Like, could you create rules for something that extreme?
Well, that's not really I push back on that because, first of all, there's clearly a conversation being had here. It looks like it took 9 hours to get a post that passes their threshold, but it didn't settle the issue.
Right. So,
I mean, ultimately what we're talking about is discussion-based subreddits. Maybe there's a place somewhere in the future where issues could just be settled by algorithm. But in terms of what I think we're trying to achieve, which is the stuff that is maybe more, in this case, like a values-based or gray area-based conversation, like that's never going to go away, and you're still going to need a place for people to have those conversations in a constructive way.
Yeah, no, I agree. I was just sort of extemporaneously wondering, like, what are the boundaries of what can be created within the rules of some human conversation on Reddit? Like, what undiscovered possibilities are there for other vacuum chambers and nuclear fission chambers that we've made that could do other weird things?
I guess Ask Historians, in my mind, is sort of like the historical equivalent of a peer-reviewed scientific paper. Like, scientific papers, there are a lot of them on the same topic, and they don't always reach an agreement or an outcome, but like you can at least guarantee that people have tried to falsify it and it has passed a certain kind of rigor before being published. So I mean, maybe there's a space for that for a lot of other kind of content. But again, in terms of the point of view stuff, my view is this, I think this, I want to have this conversation. I think the ecosystem we're looking for is a lot less binary.
You still got to have the humans there, right?
Yeah, I mean, garbage in, garbage out.
I just had this vision of like a kind of photo booth, change my view, kind of go in with your view and see if this machine can change it or something. And
like it just sets the top delta earning comments from each relevant thread in the past of all changed my view.
Yeah,
actually that'd be kind of cool.
Well, I mean, we have tried to set up that to some extent with the delta log, and we have created a button that allows people to search the delta log subreddit. I mean, the search system on Reddit could be better for this, but yeah, if people want to look through the most convincing arguments, then they just need to go to delta log and see if it works. But I do think there's a lot to be said for the human experience of posting your view and having people respond to you and you respond to them in kind of real time.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Well, there's an old saying that, you know, golf is a nice walk spoiled, right? And so, like, if I want to go have a nice time, like, I'm obviously not going to want like a robot to just go roll my ball over and drop it in the hole, right? But if I'm at a job where my job is to put as many balls in holes as possible, and it's not about the breathing experience, just like someone going through Facebook for their news feed, like any news collection from the world today is in some sense an important activity, you know, just whether it's reading a newspaper or whatever, to know what's going on in the world is this, in a way, a responsible adult thing to do. But it's coming so messy now. You know, I wanted to lean over to a topic that I'd highlighted. I just want to make sure we don't miss from the "So What" section of Liz's article. And you brought something up really interesting, Liz, and it's an awkward segue to it, but I think it kind of connects. And you'd said, instead, we need to increase the barrier of entry to the news feed and shift the burden to the probable rule violators. Like, where is the place for people who break the rules? Is there any place for punitive sorting or?
Sure. So I think when we talk about burden shifting, we have to consider that that's not the end of making your case. Like, basically, so I'm a lawyer. None of this is legal advice, of course. And I don't know why people take it that way, but I feel like I have to say it. We talk about burden shifting. The case is never over once a burden shifts. So, like, in a tort case, for example, if someone wants to bring a claim to court, they have to make a prima facie case that they could potentially meet every single element. But that's not the end of the conversation. That's just to say that it is worth our time to take this case to court. Then the burden shifts to the other party to disprove a certain amount of elements. And you can always go back and forth. I'm being a little simple in terms of my explanation, but like, it kind of goes, each person has an opportunity to disprove the other person, and the burden shifts back and forth until we get closer to the quote unquote true result. So when I talk about burden shifting here, I'm saying the burden shifts to the publications that want to be deemed, let's say, trustworthy or whatever, to show a set of features that tend to correlate strongly with that. And so when I deal in my work, when I, back in a past life, worked in product safety, we didn't have any way of knowing for sure whether a company was doing all of its due diligence, short of like going into their company and doing an audit. So we had things like, does this person have a point of contact? Is this a real company that is incorporated or is an LLC or whatever elsewhere? You know, is there a communication channel? Like, these sets of like little things that didn't prove anything 100%, but correlated very strongly that we were dealing with a good faith actor. And transposing that over here, it's like, what are some things that most news sites share that make them quote unquote news sites rather than just like trollish shit? Can I swear? I'll say shit stirrers, but we'll say maybe just trolls.
We cursed before without editing, but we don't give a formal warning. But I think it's pretty
okay, because I'm just saying,
yeah.
Like, if you look at Washington Post and Fox News, very different editorial positions on a lot of things. But we know that they each have like a CEO. We know they have editors. We know they have points of contact. We know that they are bona fide incorporated entities. We know that there's some accountability there because they have put their name to their company in the first place. There's legal liability. So what are the flags that Facebook could use? Like, just have a person on your news organization that we can talk to, because the trolls and the bots and the so-and-so are probably not going to meet that hurdle. Just put a little bit more on the people who want to have a check mark next to their news source to demonstrate that they are willing to put their name to their work. It's so a little bit of,
in principle, living up to traditional journalistic standards.
Sure. Like, I guess at the end of the day, let me put this in a simpler way, because I went down a huge rabbit hole. I'd like to back up. You put a series of checks in place that are not cumbersome. They don't stop people from being posted on Facebook. What they do is that it is a very small threshold that Facebook can adopt to say, any news source with this symbol next to it has met these 4 or 5 features. That you can be rest assured of. It doesn't mean what they're posting is true. It doesn't mean that you don't have to think about it a bit more. We haven't done all of your due diligence, but you can know that it wasn't a bot. It wasn't someone trying to troll you. Like they're most likely just a set of assurances that people can use to make a decision about whether or not how they're going to engage with that information.
Yes, we're actually much more on the same page than I thought then, because a lot of what I'm doing is basic due diligence filtering. Yeah, I mean, if what you're talking is just passive observance of basic standards, even that would get rid of 90% of the junk.
And Reddit kind of has this problem as well, though. So maybe we should talk to Reddit about some of these things. And I was just thinking there, going back to the idea of being subscribed to your sharing. If you've upvoted an article that turns out to be false or something, Reddit could build in something where you were sent a PM. But yeah, I think a lot of this stuff isn't specifically restricted to Facebook, and other platforms ought to be considered too. Although Liz does, of course, refer to Twitter as well in this article. So yes, Michael.
Well, Cal, one part of this we haven't touched on too much yet because we've really been in Facebook world is, we talk about the comparison between Reddit and Facebook and lessons Facebook can learn from Reddit. What about the other way around? And how do you feel about some of the more recent conversations surrounding design changes pending in Reddit?
Yeah, so I kind of want to refer to Liz on this a little bit because she kind of initiated this to some extent on changemyview.net with her post relating to her opinions of time well spent, etc. So we'll get her opinion in a second. But as a result of some of the conversations,
she had to step away for a second. So
yeah, as a result of some of the conversations I was having with the mod team at Change My View, and in fact with some other mod teams, I decided to initiate a group called Design for Discussion, in which we were getting other mod teams together to talk about ways that the redesign could be slightly nudged in a direction that we thought would value discussion-based subreddits a little bit more. And we can get into our conclusion of that coalition because I published our proposal to changemyview.net as well as Reddit, etc. And we can get into that in a second.
Right on. So just to give a little bit of background on some of the changes for those just listening, I haven't noticed them. One of the big changes is something called a light box, which basically floats the screen of the comments of what you're looking at above a background fuzzy on the right and left grayed out that shows the sub you're in. So you're not leaving the sub page or going to a tab, but you're just going into this floating sort of pop-up light box, they call it. And, it's just a design change that I don't know all the background on, but changes the feel in some way, maintains a lot in other ways. But Liz, did you want to chime in? We're segueing here into the other article now, unless you had something more on the Facebook.
No, well, I don't have a lot more to add on Facebook, so I'll just say that I wrote a post about Reddit's redesign, and I took more of a design philosophy approach to it, but I defer primarily to Cal in terms of some of the specific proposals. He really spearheaded the actual follow-up to that. I just want to make clear that we were definitely we were aspiring to make sure that we were not just complaining, but rather following up on some of the concerns that we have and start a dialogue with the admins to, give some constructive feedback and say, is there anything that we can do on our end to maybe help you think about this a bit differently based on our use case of a discussion subreddit?
Yeah, and I wonder, Michael, would you be able to screen share the redesign for anyone listening to go to our YouTube channel and have a look?
Absolutely. Just let me pop this up right here. Oh, that's the other one. And
so, Liz, perhaps you could kind of talk us through your first post that kind of sparked some of our interaction with the admins.
Sure. So the post kind of dovetails from what we were talking about with Facebook in terms of how design is effectively architecture that determines how people can act within an application or a platform. One thing that we cite is Joe Edelman's blog that uses an example stating effectively how when the Nazis made Jews wear stars, you could try your best to enforce that, but you would never get 100% compliance. People could flout that. But when you're dealing with a software design, a platform design, or an application design, you can't really flout the design. Whatever they want, however they want you to engage with material, you're more or less restricted by their architecture or code. So going from there, I noted that for the new Reddit redesign, a lot of it, based on how we've interacted with it, seems to create a really good user experience for like pictures and memes and visual content. And if you look at Reddit's invitation to sign up, they say, come for the cats, stay for the empathy. So it does a really good job of coming for the cats. What we were trying to pivot to is say, okay, well, we're a discussion subreddit and we're a little concerned that some of the design that's good for the cat memes and the visual content maybe makes the comment content, which is what we focus on, secondary or a little bit more cumbersome to walk through, to type. And some of that is a hardware limitation, not an application limitation. But at the end of the day, we wanted to make the point that the designs are ultimately going to determine how people can interact with content. And it seemed like a lot of the interactions with visual content were going to be frictionless and, I guess, more fluid and enjoyable. And we were concerned that being able to engage with comment content, which is what Changed My View and other discussion Reddits rely upon, was going to be a little bit harder to engage with, a little clunkier, maybe a little more confusing, a lot less intuitive. And we wanted to just highlight that so that we can start a conversation about maybe how we deal with that in terms of the Reddit redesign.
And Cal, she cites a bunch of items relating to you here as well. And I believe there's even a quote or two from you in her article, right?
Yeah, so a couple of months ago, I posted to the Redesign subreddit with my initial concerns, which were definitely fed into by the rest of the team's concerns. But I just felt like I needed to make a post, and I think you've got it there on the screen just now. And basically, I was saying that I agreed with the need to redesign because I've got experience in my close friends and family of people who just don't get it on the surface. They can't get into the subreddit or any of the subreddits, and so I acknowledge the problem. I welcome an upgrade, but I felt that as Liz was saying there, I felt like discussion subreddits were being treated secondary to visual content. And I have no real kind of like data to back that up because I don't come from a design background. I just knew it felt wrong. I knew the people I was speaking to agreed with that feeling, and so I did my best to try and verbalize that feeling. And whether or not it's completely accurate, I felt like the kind of fundamental reason was how the light box was being treated and what that suggested. And in response to my post, an admin did explain that a large driver there was the ability to use your arrow keys to flick through content quickly for power users. So that was a bit of a red flag to me, though I appreciate maybe that was just one admin's thoughts at that moment. And so
Cal, could you touch on that just one more time to make sure we didn't miss what we're visualizing? And I'm just going to, because I think this is a really important linchpin in the discussion about this, is that the idea that you're almost like a skipping stone across a lake going through different content rather than ever really settling and sinking in. Is that kind of the...
Yeah, my feeling was that the light box was allowing people to consume content quicker, which is great for subreddits like Pix, Funny, etc., where the idea is to do that, exactly that. I mean, whenever I visit a subreddit like Pix or something, I generally want to go through as many as I feel like I need to at that time. I feel like my experience of Change My View through the people I've spoken to is less of a I'll go there and like essentially consume all of the posts. I'm going to see if there's maybe one or two that I'm interested in. I'm going to spend time on it. So basically, I just felt that the Lightbox didn't represent the kind of behavior you might see on a subreddit like Change My View. But again, I must stress that our argument wasn't to get rid of the Lightbox. It was to provide the ability to either bypass it or opt out for people like myself who didn't necessarily appreciate this design choice. And we suggested in our proposal a few ways that could be achieved. So we can get into that if you like.
Well, some of it's hard to describe in audio, but for those looking, I do have the visual up of the subreddit and how it looks different.
Yeah, and please forgive the current bad design of the redesign, because not the redesign, but our own styling of Change My View. I was playing around with it yesterday.
Yeah, this is the Change My View specific customization of their design. But
yeah, and actually, Michael, you're not on the Lightbox just now. This is the static page. This is what I was hoping would be an easy thing to access. If you click the title there, you should see the Lightbox. Yeah.
There, I was wondering. So it was a direct link. That's why I didn't do it. Okay, yeah. Gotcha.
So this is what I'm referring to, and as you can see, you can still see the subreddit on either side. So it's got this feeling of a preview of something that's floating on top of the content that they want you to get kind of back to or flick through. Or it's not immersive to me, and this was my concern. I think that reading through a long Change My View discussion should be immersive, and however they achieve that feeling, I'm open to any method of achieving it. We just listed a few ideas that came to our minds, and there's multiple, and not all of them will be possible, perhaps. But I think that something needs to be done here, because if everyone's looking at what I'm looking at, perhaps they agree. And if you're scrolling down, Michael, you'll see the comments. You can imagine yourself maybe looking at a post like this and reading through the comments and finding that maybe it's not the same experience.
Yeah, I'd like to kind of build on that if that's okay. I have a separate username that I've been using solely just to use Reddit as I normally would, but with the redesign, because when I work with people to design a system or platform, I get a lot of resistance from the people who are supposed to be using it simply because it's a change. And so I thought, okay, am I doing that? And I just tried to live for as long as I could in this before writing the the blog post. And I still come away with a lot of the observations that you noted, especially with the Lightbox. And this is me being an anxious person, but as someone who tends to write longer posts, the Lightbox gives me this feeling that if I don't hurry through my response, I'm going to lose all my content. So that's partially because of the Lightbox. It's partially because it's not like you can save a draft. So something that I can do as a person who uses Reddit in this way is surface to the admins that this is my current experience and it's not a good one. But I also concede that their job is design. My job is not design. So in surfacing these thoughts and observations, I don't think the goal, I know my goal, and I know that we were clear about this when working with the other moderators, is not to make a list of ultimatums or demands or say that our proposals must be implemented. It was to say, look, we might not have the professional language to articulate what the best design response to this is. But here is what we are experiencing as moderators, representing the interests of our users and of users of those subreddits. And anything that you can do to kind of talk with us to walk through this issue would be greatly appreciated. And we just wanted to make sure that, because this is probably just an issue of, not having that same experience on Reddit, we just wanted to make sure we got eyes on it. Because I don't think this is an issue of just, wanting to diminish discussion content. I just think it's an issue of Reddit is so vast and there are so many communities with so many different goals that they are faced with the tough problem of redesigning it in a way that is useful for everybody.
Yeah, and one solution that we put forward was that the admins should perhaps consider acknowledging that Reddit has multiple uses and multiple types of subreddit, and introduce a categorization option where perhaps the mods could choose their subreddit as being discussion based, and whatever that would result in, it might just be a useful thing for the future, that that a subreddit can be categorized, and through that perhaps a few problems here could be solved.
Well, I think at the same time too, that would be really useful to find other discussion Reddits, because there isn't really like a way to do that filtering outside of like other ones lists people have made. But if I just want only Reddits that have deeper discussion or only Reddits with cat pictures, it would be interesting to see one or the other.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's just a good thing to do regardless of the problems with the lightbox. But I do think that it could also help here. And some other solutions, if maybe you scrolled back up or not, actually, it's fine, would be to introduce a toggle. So just allow users to decide whether or not this is an experience they want. Because there's enough of us. I mean, it's not just us mods that have got together. You see it in the Redesign subreddit a lot. A lot of people aren't happy with this design choice, and maybe there's an element of getting used to these things. Like Liz was talking about, the idea of change. I like to think that I'm not just averse to change here. Like I said, I respect the need for improvement, and a lot of what I'm seeing is good. So I don't think it's just a blanket like change statement. And maybe that needs to be acknowledged through options and customizability.
Well, what we're looking at here is the front page under the new reddit.com all. So this isn't change my view specific. Now we're seeing the whole gamut of content, right? So now I'm just cruising through here to kind of get the experience. Now what you can do, for those looking, you can do like these larger size posts. I guess they have cards here. Okay, so that's like show images. Okay. And then much tinier, so it's all compacted. But the preview windows still pop up in here, right? Like if you want your the light box.
Yeah, no matter what view you take, that when you left click on the title, it becomes a light box.
Oh, I did the wrong thing.
And when just left clicking in general gets
title, not the gotcha. Okay, that's weird.
But actually, Michael, if you go back to the classic view, I would demonstrate a solution that I really like the sound of, though it's not perhaps the only solution. And basically, it's the difference between clicking a title and clicking the comments button. So you're back to standard Reddit just now, but when you're clicking on the redesign, which is only available to 1% of Reddit users at the moment, by the way, hence the kind of playing around with how Change My View looks, because very few people are actually seeing it. If you, Michael, go back to the redesign tab, you can see what I mean, and there is two buttons. There's the title and the comments, and they both achieve the same result, which I found strange.
Oh, so if I go back to the main are all.
Yep, you have it in another tab, I think.
Yeah. I converted that one to standard, so we're just going to all now and new. Yeah.
Yep. If you go back to the classic view, so with the three view options.
So we got them side by side. Classic here.
No, that not. Oh, sorry. By classic, I mean, I think that's what
Up
they
here.
call
I
the
see.
view.
I see.
Yes,
I got
it's
you.
not actually old
Yeah.
Reddit.
The center of the three options within the
Yeah.
new design. Gotcha.
So you see here, there is the title, and then there's the comments button.
Yes.
If you click the title,
clicking the
it brings
title,
up the light
open
box.
like a new tab.
No, not like that. No.
Oh, okay. Just click it straight up. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So boom. So this is like a pop-up of the article. Ooh, that dude got messed up.
Yeah. So if you click the close button now in the top right corner.
Yeah.
And just now, instead of clicking the title, click that comments button. Yeah.
Oh, it's moderated. Hold on. The thread got moderated.
That's all right, though. It still gives the idea of what I'm talking about because it still brings up a light box. Admittedly, there is a slight difference in clicking this button. It takes you to the top of the comment section instead of the content. But really, that's a very insignificant difference. I think most people are quite happy to just scroll down a little bit. But basically, I thought that this was an opportunity to get the best of both worlds and keep everybody happy. Keep the title as the lightbox option and the comments button as static page. And basically what you're doing there is you're allowing people to click on the title as that I want to see what this is about, perhaps. Maybe you can justify the title clicking as being more flippant.
Yeah.
The comments button, I struggle to imagine a reason for clicking the comments other than wanting to read through the comments. So I really think that should be more immersive.
That almost sounds just an oversight, but I got to say that would definitely solve a lot of this. That's a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's right up there. It's number one in the proposal summary. It's in the proposal section. I do still think that there is reason for further customization. According to the people we've heard from, perhaps it should be opt out as a possibility for people who just really don't like this at all. But yeah, I think that the comments button leading to the static page would solve a lot of problems. And to be honest, I think it might completely solve the problem of that specific lightbox issue. Of course, this proposal deals with a lot more than just the lightbox. And I think maybe with it being so big and upfront, people get stuck on this part of the proposal. But really, we're talking about a lot more as well.
And for those listening, what we're looking at now is a proposal from 2 days ago posted by Cal in concert with the moderators of a number of other discussion subreddits. What were they totaling, Cal? And their subscribers?
As pointed out by another user, perhaps this isn't a metric really worth tying much weight to. But yeah, if you total up all the subscriber counts of each subreddit involved, it is 34 million.
And so it's a very long post with a lot of detail and really gets into the juice of the changes. So anyone who's interested in seeing how the face of Reddit may change, I would highly recommend you go in and take a look at this discussion because it's really the biggest one that's happening between the admins and the mods and users right now regarding the topic that I'm aware of. So it's really insightful, really deep, good read if you want to get into it.
And I should point out that, of course, those 34 million, there will be overlap between the subreddits involved. And also, even though if you scroll to the very bottom, you'll see the list of subreddits that signed their subreddit name. It's actually quite a confusing thing to do because there were mods of other subreddits that were participating and were interested. But as just a kind of general policy, they didn't want to put their subreddit name to it. But there was a lot wider interest in this idea than just those subreddit in terms of individual moderators. But yeah, we were quite content with the kind of the feedback we got as this being something that was needed, this grouping together. And like I said, there's lots more things we were talking about, the ability to designate different widgets for submission rules and comment rules, for example, and some other things that maybe Liz would want to talk about.
So, sorry, can you walk me back to...
Yeah, basically, we've spent a lot of time talking about the lightbox, but I think this is a kind of recurring theme is that we're getting stuck on the lightbox when actually there is other things too.
Sure, yeah, so the lightbox was... The way we wrote it is we went with this idea of we surface our biggest concerns at the top and then kind of go down in things that are maybe either less important to us or we haven't had as much time to think about. So one thing besides the lightbox, I touched on a little bit earlier, is that when you bring up the lightbox, there's this sort of perilous feeling that it's a fleeting experience. And if you're working on a very long post, there's a feeling that you're going to lose it. So one of our suggestions was that with much like there's a big editor on the current Reddit, an ability to save drafts, for example, would go a really long way, especially if there is any way to incorporate this on the mobile app. Because I know mobile use is one of the predominant ways people are interacting with Reddit now.
Oh, yeah.
So like being able to not just take the time to digest that information, but to come back to your post so that you don't feel like you have to write it out in 5 minutes without losing all your work would be a great boon to subreddits like ours. So that's one thing that I personally have a vested interest in because I raised that issue. But as for stuff that other mods brought about, Cal, like you mentioned before, the option for mod teams to categorize their subreddits as discussion-based, I think that's something that's especially useful because regardless of any implications that has for the lightbox, it's just a good kind of filtering mechanism that can be used for people who are coming to Reddit because, let's say, they listened to your NPR on interview on CMV, or they came here through Wired, and they're like, you know what, I like Change My View. What are some other subreddits like Neutral Politics? Assuming both those subreddits flagged their subreddits as discussion-based, that's a search function that a user might really appreciate and keep them coming back looking for more. That was one other addition. There's an OP icon that the redesign has that is a microphone. And for our purposes, we actually really like the idea of an OP icon. But we would prefer not having to have a microphone. It seems like a small thing, but we really try to avoid the impression that the OP is there to be on a soapbox and to simply evangelize their point of view. So having customizable OP icons would be great because I think there are a lot of things that we like to do with our subreddit that has been customizable. Like we have the Delta system and we have our flares, but what if we wanted to flag certain power users as OPs or things like that? Like Ask Historians has flares for users that are indicating what their specialty is. I don't know precisely how we'd use this, but something for OPs, because of the role OPs play in our posting, would be very useful and I think interesting to see how we might end up fiddling with that in the future. And then I just noted that there were a couple of stylistic and readability suggestions. I think this was brought to us by the user QTX, who did a lot of work with IAMA, the IMA. I don't know how you guys actually read that out loud, but it's the Ask Me Anything subreddit.
IMA, but I don't know if it's right.
Yeah, which I found really great because I thought it was a good example of how a subreddit ultimately influenced a design choice because the Q&A sort basically came about as a response to the Ask Me Anything subreddit.
Yeah.
So he was pointing out just some contrasting colors and comments and posts that would make it easier for users to interact with the content by understanding who did what when.
Yeah, the really interesting thing about the user QTX, who, as you say, is a mod of IAMA, but also designed the CSS for that subreddit and Ask Reddit and Change My View and many others, that this user has single-handedly created the face of Reddit for many people in terms of style. And so it took us really to reach out and get a section of this proposal from one of the most influential people in how Reddit looks, and to give some suggestions. Like, of course, I'm sure the admins have actually spoken to this user before, and I do believe they have posted to the Redesign subreddit and have probably been engaged with. So I'm not claiming that it's been ignored, but I felt like that was a convincing part of our proposal, that we had this user involved. And one of the main suggestions there was the alternation of comment colors, maybe making some of the buttons underneath a comment less stand out less, so maybe slightly lighter gray, so that you can read the discussion without seeing the buttons all the way through, and a couple of other things. Yeah, so that's why I found that convincing.
And what I'm looking at, I mean, we hear just in the real world, in news, more and more Reddit come up as a source, as a place where things happen, as a big part of, you know, this whole Russia thing. And I think that Reddit's going to be more and more impactful over the long term, in some sense, because it is such a purely democratically evolved platform. And just to kind of put a little context and just the weight of the importance of the conversation that we're having right now, is that we're looking at the spearhead of the interaction between the users, mods, and the admins in the biggest redesign change in years for what is quickly becoming the quickest disperser of news, arguably anywhere, or early adapters getting news out to other platforms anywhere. So this is a really important discussion for the future of how we have these conversations, and I just think it's important to take a note and look at that, and just it makes me think of, you know, this idea that, you know, people might say something like, you know, some conspiracy Illuminati thing is trying to stop the cure for cancer, or it's like, well, even Illuminati members are going to age. They're going to want that cure for cancer too. Like even Mark Zuckerberg wants to have a good Facebook experience. Even the heads of Reddit want to have a great platform that people love. And I hope that anyone involved with any of those entities listening, you know, can just keep in mind the experience that they want to have on their platforms years from now, because they've got to love using them too.
Yeah, I think the big question here is, so what? Like, why do we care so much about the Reddit redesign and Reddit in general? And I think even going beyond sim feeds is these two issues that we were talking about before. And the first is that there's clearly a thirst for having a good experience online. A lot of people are frustrated with Facebook, but where else are they going to go? And I think for Reddit, that presents an opportunity. And I would like to see them succeed. I mentioned in our redesign post that we understand completely that Reddit needs to grow and flourish as a company in order to stick around and continue being a space for Change My View to hang out. So we want to see them succeed. And I think that positioning themselves as a place where people can go for time well spent is going to be a net gain for whatever kind of business model they're currently gunning for, number one. Number two, you're gonna have to bear with me for a moment because it just left my mind. And I can't remember it.
I think this is something we were talking about before, and I just had it too. Shoot. Well, how about this? While you're thinking of that final thought, and it'll be a good way to sign off at the end, how about I look at a couple of fun posts?
Yeah, but also I just want to point out that to anyone listening, we talked about the proposal is currently pinned to the top of Change My View, the subreddit. We have also posted it as a blog post to changemyview.net, which includes pictures of some of the things we've been talking about and some of the problems. So it's got the light box, it's got the comments button, it's got the kind of the problem with self-posts at the moment is that they're smaller than visual posts, which expand automatically with the pictures. So sometimes they're lost in between. And so we've got an example of that in the blog post, and the microphones, because as Liz was talking about earlier, the OP having a microphone by their name, if you scroll through a long Change My View discussion, it literally looks like the OP is taking the microphone with them wherever they go, which if you imagine that in real life would be the opposite of the feeling we're trying to get across and Change My View, that this should be like a balanced conversation. So there's just lots of little things that I think if listened to and appreciated would value discussion subreddits, and then would value kind of general wider use of Reddit in general, because people want more than just visual content.
Michael, I think the thing I wanted to highlight, I don't know if what you were thinking about as well, is that we were talking before about operational transparency and how that really gets people coming back to your community because they feel bought into the way things are run. They're not simply behaving in a way to avoid punishment. They actually feel like the spirit of the law the spirit of the rules is good.
It's
and
just,
and I think that Reddit has already started out on the right foot in the public spheres. They've been very transparent about Russian trolls, for example, which is in contrast to Facebook. Facebook got in a lot of trouble, a lot less because of the trolling itself and a lot more because there was this slow trickle of news that just indicated a lack of control and a lack of transparency. And so I think when you look at Reddit, just the way they're run as an organization, there's already a springboard there for a lot more operational transparency and like constructive engagement with the community such that people come back and interact with one another. And again, that just dovetail into our overall thesis of, what are some ways that Reddit can succeed incorporating what we as discussion subreddits bring to the table.
Fantastic. So we are definitely over time here, but I wanted to make sure we cover everything before switching to the last segment. So
yeah, and I just wanted to say that we've talked a lot about kind of our concerns. The admins are engaging with us. You can see the top comment in response to the post and Change My View. It does bring up some points that we weren't aware of. Part of our aim in making this proposal was to try and open a discussion with the admins that would be productive going forward. So it's an ongoing process. I don't know what perhaps people have taken from listening to this, but we feel optimistic that through engaging with the admins, we can get some of these concerns solved. And this is not a slating of Reddit. It's just a update on an interesting kind of area of moderating a subreddit, specifically discussion based. And so this is just a moment in time, really. It's not an end kind of complaint.
And these discussions are just going to be crucial for forever, really, in the ongoing nurturing and curating of the development of the platform.
Also, I don't know if you were wanting to do a couple of lighthearted posts, or you decided against that due to time.
I have a couple quick ones.
Well, I was wondering that instead of that, perhaps this time, since we have Liz on, who has written 4 out of I forget how many in total, changemyview.net blog posts, that maybe we could cover one of them quickly. That was slightly less. So maybe the Devil's Advocate one.
I'm just scrolling here.
Yeah, that one perhaps, which I found interesting, because a few years ago, or a couple of years ago, Liz set up another subreddit that was relevant to Change My View. And so I was wondering if maybe she could talk about that.
Sure. So I'll talk a bit about this subreddit. It was called Not My Shoes. I'll admit flat out the distinction between this and CMV is a bit tenuous. But my goal was effectively, instead of you coming in with your view and trying to get it changed, you came in trying to argue in the alternative. You came in trying to espouse a view with which you disagreed. And then you had to defend that view. The reason why I made I distinguish it between that and Devil's Advocate is you're not doing it to be provocative. You're not doing it to get other people to see something by virtue of playing Devil's Advocate. You are trying to put yourself in the shoes of another person and understand what their thought process was in crafting that view. I kind of wish I'd taken it a bit further because I listen to a lot of podcasts. And the phrases that pop up the most relevant to this conversation are changing views, which CMV obviously covers, and putting yourself in another person's shoes.
Yes.
And it's that latter part that we try in an indirect way to facilitate at CMV. I think in order to engage with someone constructively, you have to demonstrate a lot of empathy and trying to understand where they're coming from. But we actually discourage playing Devil's Advocate. It has to be your view that you're espousing. And in contrast, Not My Shoes was basically saying, no, you come here and as the OP, you craft this view as though you are that person trying to support a given argument. And you just kind of see where it goes to connect the dots in a way that you were not forced to do in the first point, And you're not supposed to walk away suddenly agreeing with this point of view. I would really actually probably discourage that, considering some of the views that might pop up. But you do kind of understand the reasoning that another person might have in trying to espouse that position. I think it's a really good habit to get into, honestly. Like, as an attorney, they always encourage you in your writing to anticipate what the counter argument would be. And I'm a huge proponent of the notion that once you really believe something, you need to argue vociferously for it until you have a good reason not to believe it any further. And I think it's important for people to be able to articulate their view and to anticipate ahead of time how people might counter that, because it forces you to grapple with the weak points in your own argument. And, you might even walk away thinking like, that's maybe one of the fair points I'll have to concede versus one of the points that I think I can address.
Yeah, I find this very interesting because like you hinted at, we have this indirectly in the subreddit. So I would guess that those who are best at changing views kind of have to do this in the top level comments, or at least before they type up their top level comment, they've got to try and put themselves in the shoes of the person who's posted the view. But the idea of this being the kind of goal of the subreddit where the OP has to do it, I found that really interesting. And yeah, it's kind of a shame it didn't really take off.
I think another aspect of this that would make an interesting auditing tool is that if you strawman someone else's position or represent it, but I can go back into your history and you created a devil's argument of your own position, like of the other person's position. So you're on record knowing their real position in your devil's advocate exercise. And then later on, you strawman them again. You're actually more deeply culpable for the strawman because you've already proven you know their position than you are if you accidentally misrepresent it because you maybe were just subconsciously giving it an unfair shake. So I think that would be kind of a cool way to be able to audit people post hoc on strawmanning, I guess, if I'm using that right.
That's like Inception level viewing.
Fortunately, no diagrams are allowed on the podcast app on Apple does. Well, I thought we'd be remiss if Liz couldn't return the favor to give a shout out to the new podcast she got me turned on to recently.
Oh, sorry.
The opening.
Opening arguments. Okay. I mean, I guess, are we doing recommendations?
Well, they've mentioned you twice now on their podcast, so I'm like, I'm going to throw it out there to return the favor.
Oh yeah, sure.
I don't know. Sorry, it's a random idea.
Well, no, I mean, like, let's put this into the framing of our current conversation. One thing that's really awesome about opening arguments is that they are very fair-minded towards the positions that they are arguing against when they do have to take a position. And actually, they have had people on the podcast who were brought on specifically to disagree with the host, so that they felt they could more fairly represent some of the counter arguments to the critiques that the podcast was bringing. But I should mention that the point of the podcast is not actually to have view changing or disagreements, even though that probably is very adjacent to it. It's just a podcast that does a really good exploration of a lot of legal issues that are at the forefront of public conversations. So if you're the sort of person who is like, this is a lot of legalese, I don't understand it, the podcast host and both hosts actually do a very good job of sort of breaking things down in a way that's interesting and accessible. Yeah,
and Liz, I know from an attorney's point of view, I'm going into it because you were recommended as an attorney, and I'm some college educated high school graduate, and I still find it very accessible, very great, just good radio, good storytelling, but they make complicated stuff really be by, I don't know, I feel smarter than I am when I'm listening to it. They do a good job of breaking it down.
Shout out to Rusty Rook, who is another mod of Change My View, because he originally got me turned on to it, and he's not an American, and this is all about American law. So I feel like if you're an inquisitive person, this is probably going to be a podcast that you will enjoy.
Totally. Right on. Well, is there anything else we want to make sure we don't miss before we wrap up, and then we'll stay on after the end?
Can I recommend one more podcast, because I mentioned it here and I just want to make sure that I highlight it. Hidden Brain is a great podcast, and they had their most recent episode as of 4/22/2018 was an excellent deep dive into how people perceive behavior versus how they actually act, in the way that community norms and media can influence each of those things. It was really fascinating, and I think it touches on a lot of the stuff that we talked about in the Facebook portion of this. So I'd really recommend that.
Well, while we're at it, I'll do a quick one too. The Omnibus, starring Jeopardy's Ken Jennings, might be the funniest podcast out right now. Ken Jennings is probably the funniest guy in podcasting. It's fantastic. Called The Omnibus, or just look up Ken Jennings podcast. The guy from Jeopardy and another guy's on there, and it's great. So, Cal, any last thoughts?
No last thoughts from me.
Cool. Well, then all I'll say on the way out is that the two things we did not cover this week for fun posts were that the limit to Little Hulk's strength, and people who order decaf black coffee either hate themselves or have no sense of taste. And finally, change my view, Taco Bell is authentic Mexican food. So for those of you who want to go into change my view, maybe not for serious stuff, but just to get in there and get violent over whether a taco is a sandwich or you name it. There's all kinds of fun stuff going on there too. So, but I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and thank you to Cal and Liz for joining us today. Thanks so much, guys. And Gal.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Got it. And I'm going to stop the podcast now. Thanks for listening, everyone.